This is Dr. Josh Kunith, and I welcome you to the GAF Podcast, where I discuss grading, assessment, and feedback in secondary schools. This is episode 3, where I'll be talking about adapting feedback for distance learning, along with my guest, high school teacher and adjunct university instructor, Beau Larimer. I'll let him introduce himself a little bit more in a few minutes. But first, let me introduce myself. I'm a veteran English teacher and department chair at Highland High School in Bakersfield, California, and I also write and conduct research on these topics. So as I mentioned, in this episode, we'll be discussing feedback in distance learning. So it's no secret to educators that feedback is an essential part of the learning process and an essential part of teaching. John Hattie, in his Visible Learning books, has done a lot to attract attention to the importance of feedback in the classroom. At visiblelearning.org, feedback is listed as having an effect size of 0.7, and when compared to the average effect size of 0.4 of average interventions, that shows that it's pretty significant. So my concern recently is about how distance learning is going to have an impact on feedback for teaching and learning. I know I've been thinking about this a lot in my own teaching, and I usually spend lots of time thinking about and implementing feedback in my classroom, and I continue to do that. However, I'm continuing to think and just try to ruminating on to what extent am I being effective. So as I've mentioned, I brought in a guest today, and he's going to talk more about this and share some of his ideas and what he's doing on feedback during distance learning.
Your footsteps and kind of the digital footprint I see you constructing. You had writer on yours, and I am less of a writer than you, certainly, but I aspire to be one. So I thought I would more and more as I publish stuff and look at teaching writing, I try to view myself as a writer. So I put writer researcher there as well, and then my contact info is there at the bottom. So that's been my story. I substitute taught as well for teaching, and then as far as experience goes, it's been really fun. One thing I like about my career so far is I've had a chance to teach widely different levels. So I've taught ninth grade a class called Pre-Access in Kern High School District, which is a literacy class where some of the lessons are on phonics, and you're dealing with kind of more extreme behavioral issues at times. Really teaching readers and writers below a third or fourth grade level, and then all the way up on teaching juniors at English majors at the university. So it's been interesting seeing where the differences are, but then seeing how many good teaching practices are good with literacy students as 14-year-olds and good as well with students that are older than me and very skilled writers and readers at the university level. So
so thank you for coming. And so I think I really value your perspective as a teacher in high school, and then also an instructor at the university level, and just really an authentic look about feedback and how we're using that in our transition to distance learning. And so with that, if you're okay, we'll get to our first question.
Absolutely.
And wondering a little bit about your philosophy on feedback. So we'll start kind of big picture and get more specific to the details of application. So can you tell us about your philosophy about the role of feedback in your teaching and who's an influence also?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I really like that question. So to kind of frame the philosophy question here, I'll give you just a brief snippet of kind of how my entry point into teaching. I mentioned originally I wasn't planning on being a teacher, and then my dad works for the Panama school district, which is a middle school district, and he hired me to coach middle school sports. And so I had never taught anything, and I was working on my degree still, and I began coaching everything from track and field to volleyball to basketball. And that's where I would say I kind of fell in love with teaching, is through kind of the lens of coaching. And when I moved towards, hey, I can make a career of this and kind of apply it to my other passion, English and reading and writing and literacy, and kind of share the coaching passion I discovered with the craft of our field. That was kind of my entry point. So the coaching sports perspective kind of shaped my perspective on feedback quite a bit, and on teaching So as I entered that, I really started thinking about and avoiding giving editing feedback to a document versus giving coaching feedback to the learner. That is.
Well, I was just going to jump in there real quick, and that's something we both have in common. I don't think we've talked about that before, but as far as both being former coaches, I coach football and played for quite a while. So I really like that aspect too of, the coaching mindset and being like the coach of students, and I think that as coaches know, feedback is a huge part of coaching, right? And I think there's a great analogy there to apply to the classroom.
Yeah, and it's interesting, as I'm sure you can relate to this, you teach students that are very intentional non-learners in the classroom, right? And they are doing as little as possible. They are very resistant, and they don't want to do anything challenging or difficult. They complain about that, but then that same student will go out into 100-degree heat in Bakersfield in an afternoon and do this gritty practice, be very receptive of a coach's feedback on the football field, the basketball court. And so really trying to help the students shift their perspective as learners in receiving coaching feedback is something as well. It's interesting. I think both of those things, right? You need to teach the students how to receive and utilize feedback as well as give the most constructive feedback yourself. Is it okay if I move on to the second part of the question?
Yeah. So who's been an influence on that philosophy?
I'm going to start in the field of education and then kind of talk about how I've drawn insights outside of the field of kind of high school, secondary education. So absolutely, first person I need to talk about is one of the first kind of educators that I read about as a teacher looking to improve my craft. And his name is Kelly Gallagher. I'm sure many English teachers may recognize the name. He's known in some circles.
Got to, yeah. He's a must. Yeah, he's a must know.
Yeah. And especially, right, its influence on that philosophy, because actually he coached, he's an avid sports fan, has coached sports. I remember my first
Angels
conference.
Fan, right?
Right. My first conference before I was even an educator, I was in grad school. He pulled up this image of Allen Iverson complaining about practice versus the game, and he talks about the value of practice. Yeah. Right. And so he talked about talking about practice. So he really spoke to me, and so one of his he has many good books, but I think one that captures his philosophy really well, especially as he's moved even more towards feedback through the practice of conferring 180 days. The other author, Penny Kittle.
By the way, 180 days is the audiobook is free right now.
Yeah, I saw
that. The publisher is offering that. Yeah.
Yeah. And they've had a great, I mean, you and I mentioned this, they have a great podcast of their own of sorts going on right now on YouTube. And then Penny Kittle, his author, also you can see probably giving feedback right in that picture of this right beside them, where you practice the craft and you're coaching the craft. So that's
her book. I was just going to add, her book, Book Love, is great too for independent reading and giving feedback in specific to reading. Yeah, great authors.
Yeah. And then one other educator I'll mention, who not many people I've talked to have heard of him, much more theoretical, some of his stuff, but he does have useful things as well. There's an author named Ron Richart, and he wrote a book called Visible Thinking and Cultures of Thinking. And it's not feedback specific, but it touches on many things that relate to feedback, especially we'll talk later about building a culture of feedback. He has some great insights on that. The other thing that I drew from in shaping my philosophy has been a field, not necessarily secondary education, but a field kind of best described by, it's called the field of meta learning, and kind of a new field that focuses on deliberate practice. There's a concept of deliberate practice. One of the books I'll talk about later is by an author named James Clear that talks about deliberate practice through habit formation.
Great book. I love that book.
Have you read this book?
I read it a month ago, and I like to read it again.
Yeah.
Great book. Yeah, I recommend that highly to my students.
Oh yeah, and for the listener, his blog is phenomenal.
It's great.
And he talks about deliberate practice. Deliberate practice also is talked about by this author, Anders Ericsson, and he's looking at how expertise is developed. And his thesis really is it's not necessarily talent. It's this very intentional, systematic, coached feedback. And then Tim Ferriss is an author. He wrote a book as well on meta learning called The 4-Hour Chef. And he goes into how people can teach themselves different skills. And he talks about deconstructing his skill, but big part of his instruction is finding a coach and that gives you the right kind of feedback. And so that's been an interesting thing to kind of diversify as well. One other educator I forgot to mention was Dave Stewart Jr. Phenomenal blog. And he just released a new book, and he talks his many blog articles on feedback that are excellent.
Okay, great. Now, you didn't mention John Hattie. Has John Hattie at all in visible learning impact you?
Yes, absolutely. John Hattie, his meta-analysis, visible learning, not visible. I mentioned visible thinking. Visible learning is his analysis. And absolutely, one of the high leverage elements in his meta-analysis is feedback. I think it's a 1.5, which in that scale is high leverage. And then also,
I mentioned that in the intro.
Okay.
Sorry, I mentioned that in the intro to this, and it depends on which aspect of feedback you look at. But just feedback in general, it's a 0.7 effect size, which is still pretty big. But there are more specific aspects of it, which are higher, I think.
Right, and it ties to other things too, right? Student self-reporting. I think a student's ability to self-report kind of assess and be reflective as a learner ties to how they receive feedback and how they receive what feedback is offered to them. So absolutely, that's another huge seminal study or meta-analysis of studies. Yeah. Right.
Okay, so maybe we'll get specific to distance learning if it's all right with you here. So we have this shift, we're about approximately a month in or so, give or take a week, and depending on the school, which part of the country and stuff like that. But so I'm wondering for you, because I've been thinking about this a lot as I'm practicing feedback with my own students. But how is feedback changed in distance learning as compared to traditional face-to-face learning? How is it realistically different, for you so far?
Yeah. So real quickly, just answering that question, I have to tell you, Josh, I've told people this before. Usually I have a educator's fantasy, which is usually occurs in the middle of my own classroom, right, where I'm right next to students and I can't help them figure out technology. The sixth kid can't get Wi-Fi in that lesson or whatever the case. And I imagine myself with only a piece of chalk and a blackboard and books, papers, and pencils and regular paper, and just teaching with only that without technology. So it can be frustrating. But I think when you think about it, learning is a social experience. So reconstructing that learning over basically over zeros and ones of online communication is really, really challenging. Especially, we mentioned earlier, coaching the learner and not necessarily editing one particular document. And it's really difficult through kind of Google comments or kind of editing documents it's really challenging to not do that. It's easy to fall into that trap. So two things that I've really been trying to pursue. Well, the first thing is I have to remember not all students have access to technology. I'm sure that is something people have talked about. But I think another thing people have forgotten to talk about is many students are not as technology literate as people tend to assume that they are.
Right. We assume they are because they're young, right?
And because they love cell phones, right? So they go,
That's right.
Goes, they have a cell phone in their hand, they're digital natives, right? So of course, no one asks the question is, are they going to be able to figure out the tech on their end? And you and I have had plenty of our first podcast was a challenge, technically speaking.
That's right.
So I think that is tough. So I'm trying to look at some of the online elements as enrichment, and I'm going to teach the ones that can access it as best I can, while also being considerate and teaching the ones that maybe can't access it. So I think it's helpful to keep those in mind.
Yeah, that's a good point. And just briefly here. So I wonder, the kids who do not have that access to the technology, or they just have really tough times, even if they have access, they have a tough time with technology. And by the way, I find about 25% of my kids on average, I think, are not big fans of technology. That's just kind of year in, year out on average. But what about those kids though? Like, you know, I find it very hard to say that we're going to do something that's going to end up in equal educational opportunity, right? There's just too many equity issues. How can we really do that? I mean, we can't, right? I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, for Pete's sake, they're driving buses around town to try and provide hotspots. So it's really everyone's doing the best.
In the best of the situations, yeah. That's, we're lucky that that's thought of as innovative right now, and you know, for the time being, it is. But you know, we've talked about that. Even that is an equity issue, right? Like, you got to have a car to go out, and what kind of situation are you if you're sitting in the parking lot or you're sitting on the curb next to a bus to learn? Right.
Yeah. So I think that's a challenge. I think though, you can't say, I mean, you do, and secondly, right, this is a crazy time. I think to say the educators have to do ... I think educators are doing the best they can overall. Yeah. But you have to remember, educators are suffering some of the same craziness and health concerns, and anxiety that students are. So yeah, God bless the ones that are able to do what they can do. But this is definitely a time for being understanding and gracious with all those situations. But that being said, I think you do have to, right, that there's still the challenge of, in some ways, there's better ways to provide feedback through an online platform, and there's not as good ways. So one tool that is okay, I'm getting a little bit concrete here, but I think pursuing coaching so really looking at what tools I have at my disposal or work best is how can I create, we'll talk about culture later, and culture is part of it, but how can I create that communal element of working with the kid and not just working with the document of the kid.
Yeah. Wait, why don't we do that? I'm sorry. Why don't we just go ahead and do that right now? Like you said, this is about the culture of feedback, and maybe if you can just explain what that is, since you've kind of brought that up, and then you can go more into some specific ways to help to foster a culture of feedback.
Absolutely. So I think we've touched on a big tenet of the culture of feedback, right? Is that coaching element, right? Where you're not an editor, you're a coach, right? You're not editing their writing, you're coaching the writer, the author, the reader, the student. So I think that's one of the big lenses that I approach it with. I think the other important thing with the culture of feedback is making sure that students see the utility of it, which a big part of that has to do with how timely the feedback is, right? Son of PE teacher, entered through coaching. I know that you have the sports connection. Gallagher mentioned this as well, getting feedback at halftime and not getting feedback at the end of the game when it's just not as useful. So creating a culture of it's continuous incoming feedback that's informing the practice and the skill of the student. And that really shapes it being viewed as useful for the students, right? So that's an important element. The other important element is making sure that it is not overly harsh, that it's constructive. And that helps the students see it as the intention behind it, right? You don't want to give harsh and be careful even in giving the best constructive criticism. If it's all constructive criticism, then the criticism is not going to be received even if it's constructive, right? Because it's just criticism. Feedback is not just criticism. It's mining the successes, right? And noticing what the student's doing well, affirming them, right? And responding to their writing and their reading, and not just criticizing it. So I think having kind of a balance that leans a little bit more towards encouraging, responding, and mining successes. And then once that culture has been established, then knowing sometimes, hey, here is a non-judgmental way that we could work on moving away from certain elements of the skill. So those are my big thing with that.
Yeah, I think you bring some really good points. And I think one of the things that you kind of have brought up without explicitly using the term is a growth mindset and fostering a growth mindset in kids. Now, it depends, I think, in what direction this whole school closure goes and how long it lasts, really, but I think in one way we could say that if we can say that we're lucky in one way, it could be that hopefully we've already established that culture of feedback in our classroom.
Just you posted this on your Twitter. That's where I watched it. Fauci was asked the same question yesterday. And then the date of our filming is okay if I state that.
Go ahead.
Oh yeah. So the date of our filming, the 9th, I believe, right? April 9th.
I think so.
Yeah. If Fauci sounded Fauci sounded optimistic that we would be back in the fall.
Yeah, he did. He said, people can start planning for their summer vacations possibly. But that was good. And so hopefully we don't have to worry about this in the future. But I do think things are going to change. But anyway, we're not establishing a culture of feedback from scratch here over the computer. We do have that that was hopefully established already, right? So how can you, Beau, what do you think in your mind? Because there is that disconnect when you're using asynchronous learning, or even if you're synchronous learning, you're still across a computer screen instead of in front of somebody. But how do you continue then to foster a culture of feedback in distance learning? Is this something that you've thought about or you've had a chance to try to focus on yet?
Right, absolutely. So in experiencing distance learning as a student, and in doing parts using distance learning in a supplemental way, I haven't taught a distance-only course, so I've used it in a supplemental fashion. But really, the pitfall to avoid with becoming a distance learner is you become simply an assigner grader. So instead of you move from teaching into I assign it, I grade it, I assign it, I grade it. The reason we're focusing on this is so much of the teaching act is that mid-process feedback. Because if the feedback is only attached to, hey, I've given them feedback, I told them it was a crappy paper, I told them, hey, this is when they turned it in, or whatever the case may be, that's not quite as useful, and that's not quite the same thing, right? The big part of culture of feedback is continuous and immediacy. So I think in some ways it can't truly exist online in the imperfect world of technology, right? Where we can't just ignore the fact, right, that a second ago we were talking about how some students don't have the literacy skills, don't have the access. So I think under that, in that case, it can't perfectly exist, but I think you can pursue it as best you can. One thing I've been really looking at is I have looked at using Google Meet and using kind of live conferencing. So with my college class, I'm able to give immediate feedback because I have virtual office hours, and it's very they're just a little bit more equipped due to access and literacy with having this live video experience of kind of virtually talking about their learning and coaching them, explaining, coming alongside them virtually. And looking at our situation, I don't know that that's very realistic. First of all, I think the access thing comes back up. Second of all, launching something that you have not done before only online, with a system that wasn't designed to be online, I think is unrealistic. However, that being said, I am going to try and do it with Flipgrid a bit, and then also we mentioned this earlier. Open a single point rubric really focuses on giving descriptors to the author and the writer rather than just the editing a document, like a comment on a document.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And let me just mention real quick, the culture of feedback comes from multiple places. I should have mentioned this a minute ago, but it does. John Hattie does have a chapter in his book, Visible Learning Feedback. That's the title of the book. He has a chapter that is culture of feedback for those who are looking for some more information on that. So we've been talking about some practical details. You started to get into some of those technologies, Beau. Okay. And so can you kind of do maybe a compare contrast between, so how you typically provide feedback in your normal class or the face-to-face, and then distance learning, how you're adapting? So.
Absolutely. So face to face, just like back to our analogy, right? The kid trying to learn how to shoot a free throw, you come stand next to the kid, um, giving. The other thing with feedback, right, is uh, coaching in a way that looks at effectiveness and efficiency, right? You can give immediate, continuous feedback in a way that's not that doesn't zero in on what is the most useful to the immediate growth of the student. So I think emphasizing that and how you give feedback, but then also with modeling, right? For me, talking next to the student, showing them my writing, showing them some of what I'm doing as a writer or what I'm doing as a reader, gives them kind of a model to look at. And then that is a great place for me to compare. So I do that with conferring. I do that with small group instruction. I mentioned single point rubrics. I've used those before, and I like the way they're set up. And so those are some of the primary ways that I do it. So
can I just ask real quick, when you say modeling, you say, standing beside the student, and I'm picturing, so you literally going up to one-on-one with students and showing your model versus on an overhead or Elmo or whatever it might be, is that, or both, or?
Both, right? So in some of the folk, right, in the gradual release of responsibility, some of the direct instruction pieces are modeling, right? But then also, right, referring to that in the feedback, right? Or referring to another way of modeling, in my mind, is referring to a mentor text, right? So having the student look at the mentor text moves, look at what Mr. Larimer's doing in the writing process, and then talking to them about kind of where they're at and giving them feedback on the direction they're headed. What could they work on? What they're doing well. So yeah, absolutely. So one thing that was interesting in kind of comparing that, so how can I capture that in some way, in a realistic way for my class, based on some of the tools I've at least in some way mentioned already or referred to. And then, I'll mention that. So conferring, right? How do you capture that? I think with my college class, I am doing kind of live Zoom, Google Meet type stuff. With my students, I don't think that's as realistic. Right.
Have you tried office hours with your kids?
So I haven't yet. I'm going to try to. It's worked well with my college class. I'm going to try to do it with my regular students. I certainly am going to do it. So I talk about coaching the speech and debate team. That's a group that would be, I think, a little bit more adept to it, right? Being, I think my feelings, they're a little bit more technology literate based on some of the things we've done as a debate team. So I'm going to definitely try those tools. But one of the things I'm bummed out a little bit, though, is in looking at Zoom and Google Meet. Zoom is way better in several ways. Having a waiting room feature, having small group breakouts. Neither of those exist on Google Meet. Also, I can foresee this. Zoom having a freemium version allows students to enter Zoom as a technology more easily, where Google Meet, they have to sign on to their G Suite. And I've found that students are not always great about signing on to the right account digitally.
Yeah,
right?
That's right.
Those are just, I just know those, or I anticipate those would be issues. So I'm certainly going to try and launch it as best I can, but I'm less optimistic about that. Then the next best thing is I've introduced in some way Flipgrid. I think is becoming more and more of a great tool. I've seen Kelly Gallagher use it to great success. I've intended to use it supplementally more than I have. I wish I had. But interesting changes they've made. On Flipgrid now, you can record up to 10 minutes and you can do a screen record.
Okay, good.
So
good.
I'm very interested to see, and that one is not as time-based, right? They can get this video response that's talking to them. If it's a screen recording feature, right? I can screen record their document I'm looking at. They can respond by screen recording and voicing over, hey, looking at this paragraph or looking at this sentence or this thesis or whatever. Here's my questions. And I think that could be a really cool tool, right? Because you don't have to capture that moment in exact linear time.
Right. And so here's one thing that I've been thinking about. A couple thoughts come to mind, but I feel like, unfortunately, I didn't use these tools as much as I could have, or maybe I should have, in regular face-to-face classroom. And so I haven't worked with kids on these, and I find it kind of a daunting task to try to start something like Flipgrid right now with kids, because just knowing normally in the classroom how specific I would be and this step, this step, this step, and how many questions there would be with kids, normally. So that's what's holding me back right now. How are you going to help kids? How are you going to help kids get into that so they all, hopefully, as many as possible have access, and then you can give them that feedback that you're looking to give, or they can give you feedback.
Yeah, exactly. Right. That is the question that I have been wrestling with since the day that I last saw them, right? The last day that I saw them, I entered and was preparing for the lesson, and I started prepping Flipgrid, and then I ditched it, and I didn't do it initially because I knew that I wouldn't have all the students there anyways, and I really needed to launch something more accessible. So I was launching they're checking out a book club, and they're going to do some notes on it. And then at that point, I was hoping we would come back later in the spring and then elaborate in book club discussions. But that's the other thing, right? Is it's a tool for more than just feedback. It would be great if I could pursue that. I've talked to other teachers on my campus, and I know that it's a more common tool. So that's one reason for me to be somewhat more optimistic. But kind of to your point, your question is, yes, that's a question I've been wrestling with to a great deal. And Gallagher mentioned in his podcast in wrestling with a similar type question, do you provide online learning to the students who can access it if it doesn't interfere with the quality of instruction you can provide to all? And I think that's what each educator has to figure out. So, I mean, it's all new. I'm optimistic that I can do some enrichment and connect in some way with kids and use that to build community and do that. And then, but also, be prepared for the students that are not going to get access to that. So concrete example of that exact thing. I launched Flipgrid, launching Flipgrid. I have a kid jump on, immediately respond, right? And I started with kind of a community builder type thing with that first use of it. But I was able to connect with the kid and talk to him in kind of that Flipgrid fashion. And then I had another kid look at the Flipgrid topic and then send me his response in an email, not a Flipgrid response. And I think that's where you have to show them grace and go, hey, this kid sees the information on class is linked on Classroom. He can get onto Flipgrid, but he doesn't want to do it or he can't do it all the way. And then just allow him to respond through email and just being flexible.
Yeah. And we're, the thing is, of course, if you get 150 different varieties of responses and ways that you have to help kids to get into it, that's a lot. That's tough. That's a struggle. But like you said, got to be flexible.
To be completely honest, I've been up the past week. I've been up at all hours of the night trying to launch some kind of constructive thing. And that's why I think due to the fact that, you're building the plane in the air, right? That applies to almost every educator. And I think some educators are going to do that in a lot more, they're going to devote a lot, are able to and willing to devote a lot more time to how intense a process that is. And I think some educators won't be able to do that. And I think you have to show understanding to the educator struggling with that as well as the student.
Yeah, good point. Can we talk a little bit about reading? So
Absolutely.
you mostly were talking about writing. And so if you could say just a little bit about it in your classroom, again, and then what you're thinking about for feedback for reading, if you are, for distance learning.
Right. And that's what, highly recommend it. This book is one of the big takeaways from this book. He talks about how skill is attached to habit and habit is attached to identity, right? And identity is attached to the group and the ability to practice and the value of the activity. So really with helping students increase volume in reading, you have to think about how can I help them shift their identity, right? And that refers back to your point about growth mindset. As I launch my basically free SSR reading, my high choice reading for students, right? That's the goal of that, is to help them get to the point where they're building volume and they're hopefully shifting identity a little bit, right? And I've had comments in pursuing that. I think it's the right thing to pursue, as tough as it is, and it's a battle to really pursue that well. And it's one of those things where you don't just assign it, right? You have to confer and teach and coach and come alongside that reader. I have students come up to me day one that go, Mr. Larimer, we got to get one thing straight here. I don't read. I don't like reading. I don't read. It's not my thing.
Not a reader.
I'm not a
identity.
reader, right? It's not there. They resist that identity, right? I even had a student really feel for her in this situation. Foster kid entered second semester after it started, and we were doing a reading thing, and we did a SSR kind of rotation thing. And one of her friends, she saw some of the books that this kid was going to read after I conferred with her and nudged her towards certain things and tried to come alongside her and get her into it. And one of her friends said, why do you have those books? I thought you don't like reading. And she said, well, I don't, but these particular books look somewhat interesting. So I think using conferring, but really giving feedback to the identity and the challenges and the struggles and the successes of a student in building that identity and volume is important. And then the other element of reading is teaching the skill of reading in more of an intentional, close reading, wrestling with a text kind of way, which you would do in core text, you would do in book clubs a little bit more. And that you would use feedback as well. If you're using a writing to learn thing that aligns with reading, absolutely. Or conferring and using the rubrics that they give good descriptive feedback to the skill of reading.
And so you're saying you're planning to do that also in distance learning?
So I launched a book club book just because I don't know. It felt like it was something I was going to do anyways. It felt like I had recently heard Gallagher talk about book clubs sometimes got intentional non-readers reading. A lot of my students, too much unlimited choice is too much choice. So a book club, hey, here's these 5 books. They're sitting on tables. You're with your compatriots. Choose a book. We went back to the classroom. Okay, now go group together with the other people that chose your group to instill this kind of, hey, me and my pals are all reading The Blind Side, or me and my pals are reading Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian. And I was hoping that would kind of instill interest. And yeah, it was one of those things. They're in their book club group. This is probably why they did the closure of the schools. Enrique, one of my students, he reaches out and he's like, hey, Chris, I love you, man. Because they know, right, they're about to not see each other for a little while. He says, I love you, man. He grabs Chris's hand and kisses him on the hand. And during our days, I was like, Enrique, we don't want to do that kind of thing in this moment, right? The handshake is off the table, so the kiss on the hand is too. I thought that was hilarious. Sorry, I couldn't resist sharing that anecdote.
Social distancing so much.
But so pursuing this, how can I encourage it? The tough thing too is kids don't have my physical classroom library. I take the kids regularly to our school library to fill gaps where mine isn't as complete. So I can't do that. So I've been really trying to put out, hey, here's how you can get access to e-library texts. I don't know if I cross copyright issues, but as much as with being conscious of that, I've tried to link them to YouTube playlists of people reading a book, an audio book. And so I'm trying to present, hey, here's different options. So then I'm going to use hopefully some of the same conferring things, right? Where I get them, hey, share maybe, right, with, in some kind of Flipgrid, or share your notes that you took, or share, and then give feedback to them in that way. Right. But I'm not going to, one thing, I'm not going to teach the reading of Shakespeare.
Yes. You know, that really gets me, because I've heard of this, you know, around the country, teachers assigning Shakespeare or classic novels, you know, for that matter. And I feel like we have no obligation to continue business as usual, because it's not business as usual, right? If we have that hard of a time, I mean, you got me on, this is an issue that I have. You know, if we have that hard of a time in the classroom with kids teaching Shakespeare, then we have no business assigning it when they're at home. Great point.
The people people at my school, I think are launching Shakespeare online due to the fact that, you go with what you know. This is what we're going to cover initially. And I just don't, even excerpting scenes, I just don't think you could provide the teaching necessary through this online built as the plane is flying platform that's equitable and fair to students that have a tough time with that. So in moving towards reading, I'm going to, why do we read Shakespeare, right? Because he has great poetry. He speaks to truths of our time. So I'm going to see if I can move into kind of some kind of slam poem piece, right? Where it's really
Okay,
accessible,
nice.
it's really relevant, really high interest,
Yeah.
lots of choice, and use slam poetry as an entry point. And then on the writing side, trying to get into journaling, I think is a really important thing to try and leverage at this point as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
But yeah, so
Right.
it's a challenge.
So last big question I have, and there's one follow-up question here. If I could pin you down to one thing, if you had to say one area moving forward, we know we're going to be out of school until the rest of the semester now, distance learning for our district until the end of May. What's one area of feedback that you want to try to improve in distance learning? One aspect of feedback.
To improve during distance learning, or just try and carry over?
To try to improve. So
Improve, okay.
of feedback, right?
Okay. So one area. I think that the pitfall that I mentioned earlier about coaching the reader and the writer and not the product. I think that's something that I struggle with in the regular classroom. And because it can be such a challenge, I want to resist that temptation, but I also want to improve in that way. That would be the central one. If I had a plan B answer, I think focusing the specificity of feedback. I think the specificity of feedback, oftentimes you give them feedback that's not as useful or not specific, that's really general. And I think giving specific limited feedback is more useful than giving really broad general feedback. So I would say one of those two areas is where I'll try to zoom in and do better at, especially right considering in the distance learning platform. I think as many educators are painfully learning, what teaching is a lot more time consuming in many ways. So I think circulating a classroom, coming alongside them, the organic nature of that is a little bit easier time-wise to manage than, like you said, navigating the barrier of that technology can consume so much time. So I think being really specific and targeted with the feedback, along with using it to target and coach the reader, not the product, is the battles I want to focus on fighting.
Yeah, I like that. I like that focus on specificity, and I think I need to continue to do that. And I think that in my case at least, that specificity along with the timeliness is something that it's a constant struggle in the regular classroom, but now too, just because of getting used to the technology and how to give that. Okay, you talked about some books. You've already talked about some books that you're reading.
Absolutely.
Can you give some? I don't know if you have something else planned to share about what you're reading right now. Anything fiction? Are you reading any fiction? I don't know if you had a hard time during these lockdown days, stay-at-home days, reading fiction, or if you're still into it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm an avid fiction reader, or vacation book reader, I guess you could call it. And so I do like a mix of both. That's something, right, we communicate to learners, right? Is sometimes you read a vacation book and sometimes you read one that's a little bit more challenging.
Right.
There's value to both things. So the book, it's interesting. This was a book I did a book talk on with my class. It's the one I'll probably use as kind of a model of myself as a reader when I talk to the readers virtually in some way, is Stephen King's The Institute. We got his newest book, 3 copies of it in the library. I did book talks on it. I did do a book talk on it. Kids have seen it, like the Stephen King movie adaptation. So he's a popular author. And so I've been reading and talking, kind of modeling the process of really helping my intentional non-learners build kind of a habit of reading. And so I would read with them. We did kind of a habit tracker checklist together, ungraded thing, just to kind of see, hey, as we move through chunks of a book. So I did that in class originally, and I got home and I was able to do what I normally do with a fiction book, is just binge the heck out of it. So once I got home, I finished it within a week. And so it was really good. It was different than the usual Stephen King book. I've not been able to stick with some of his books because he does get kind of zany and weird and take different directions with the plot, which sometimes loses me my interest. But this one I found very interesting. Shades of Stranger Things in this book as well. I feel like there's kind of an undertone of his political commentary about how kids in ICE camps have been treated sometimes, I think. But it was a very enjoyable book, very exciting, great fiction read. And then I mentioned this earlier a couple times. I've been reading through Atomic Habits by James Clear, book. And I've been really enjoying that as well. Right now, I'm at the part in this book where it's looking at environment and belonging. Oh, I just read the part about environment, and now I'm reading about kind of the belonging element in shaping habit formation and shaping the practice and improvement of skills, which I apply personally to myself as well in trying to pursue constructive habits. But then also I see the educational value of it as well, is right.
Lots of application.
I could do a book talk on the Institute, but nothing gets the kid into other kids' books into other kids' hands than seeing other classmates read, right? I've had students go, wait, you're reading the book, right? You're reading, right? Why are you reading this book? And them talking about a book of interest. I think a sense of, hey, people like me, he talks about this, I think, in this book, people like me are doing stuff like this. It's such an informative thing on behavior of students, not to mention kind of that shift towards a growth mindset as well. Yeah,
great. Thanks for sharing. I think that's just about our time.
So, but real quick, Josh, I want to hear, did you talk about in your intro the book that you just finished reading?
No, I did not talk about that in my intro, but I'll mention that real quick.
Yeah, I would love to hear because I read it last summer. I would love to hear your thoughts on it. I absolutely loved.
Let me say the book first, so everybody knows what it is we're talking about here. And I'm just going to mention it briefly, and we can talk more about this. But just finished the Coddling of the American Mind, and I thought it was a great book. I think it's an important book that I definitely recommend educators to read. And you had recommended, like you said, almost a year ago, and Kelly Gallagher, I know, has strongly recommended it too. And so I really like it. I think it really applies to our world today and politics and just life in general for society and living in a democratic society. So it's a good one for sure. I'm reading Book Thief right now in the middle too, and that's a great book as well. That's my fiction read for right now. But I think we are out of time for now. So thanks a lot, Beau, for being a guest and talking about some real world feedback issues and ways that you're addressing them and things you're struggling with, both in the K through 12 classroom, high school specifically, and in college as well, and as we transition to distance learning. So appreciate your time and the insights that you've given. I think they're pretty helpful.
Awesome. It was great talking to you. Just as kind of a final closing comment, I think if I was to just leave one thing that has really informed my process and approach to feedback is the thing that we mentioned a couple different times, right? Really looking at the perspective as a coach of the learner and the author and writer and reader or scientist or whatever you're trying to help that kid develop as a skill and identity in their academic pursuits, and not an editor of any particular piece that they're working on only, right? And really working towards giving feedback to the learner, not just editing the piece.
Yeah, great way to end it. Thanks a lot, Beau.
All right. Thank you so much, Josh. Great talking to you.
If you've made it this far in this podcast, I want to thank you for listening. Again, this was episode 3, and I invite you to go to my website at joshkunith.com. I'm also on Twitter at Josh Kunith, and please listen to future podcasts as we talk further about grading, assessment, and literacy.